Welcome to It's Your Dime, a straight talk interview series presented by Shift Gold. I'm your host, Mike Meharry. In this episode, I'll be talking to Michael Boldin, the founder and executive director of the 10th Amendment Center. In this episode of It's Your Dime, Michael and I discuss the 10th Amendment, the inspiration for the 10th Amendment Center, the importance of political decentralization, how states, localities, and even individuals can stop federal overreach through nullification, sound money, and how currency competition can undermine the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money. Thank you again for watching It's Your Dime. Today I am with my good friend, colleague, and technically my boss, Michael Boldin, who is the founder and executive director of the 10th Amendment Center. How you doing, Michael?
I'm doing awesome. Thanks for having me on, Mike. And we're doing full disclosure, of course.
Full disclosure.
We've worked together for about 9 years at the 10th Amendment Center. You started out as a volunteer, joined in, you're part of the team, and really, I mean, you're basically most of the team at this point. So thank you so much for inviting me to be on the show.
So pretty much all of the answers that you're going to give, I've given you over the years.
Exactly.
So I like to start my interviews with a segment I call Who the Heck Are You and Why Are You on My Show? Which is your opportunity to just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, kind of where you're coming from. And in the process of this, you have to tell us at least one thing about yourself that has absolutely nothing to do with this interview.
One thing, or can I talk for like 20 minutes about other stuff?
You can tell us as much as you want, and then I'll edit all the stupid stuff out.
Now, that in and of itself might be something about myself that I would have an interest in telling so many stories. I mean, we're not going to use the term narcissist at all because that would be derogatory, and I'm not into that self-deprecating humor at all. But, I grew up a good socialist in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We were at the time when I was a kid, if you voted for a mayor, and this is before I was of voting age, but I remember that there would be a choice on the ballot that you would be, they talk about in the papers and local news. You'd have an option between someone running with an R or someone running with an S, not a D. Mayor Henry Meyer was the mayor there for decades. So I was raised in an area where I learned that every problem was a government solution. It was just rampant. And our neighbors over in Minnesota, you didn't have Republicans and Democrats. These are old school Marxists there. It was Republican and the DFL, Democrat Farm Labor Party. So I came from an environment where the solution to everything was government, and it was a big roadblock. And so I really understand. I spent a lot of my time in my activist work actually being able to understand and reach out to people that come from that. And I think it's really important to be able to do that if we're ever going to get advances towards liberty. Am I even answering your question, or am I just talking at this point, Mike?
No, that's outstanding. And actually, I think that's part of why you and I make a good team, because I came from the opposite side of the political spectrum. I was the hardcore right-wing, Rush Limbaugh, Go America, war-loving Republican. And so I think between the two of us, we have a pretty good
1-2 punch.
1-2 punch, yeah.
See, that was it right there, too.
There it is. That's right. So you founded this crazy organization that is called the 10th Amendment Center. I would imagine that a lot of people watching maybe have heard about it. They probably heard me talk about it because I mentioned it on these interviews before. But I don't think a lot of people necessarily know what the 10th Amendment is, because we're all products of government schooling. I didn't really know anything about it up until I got older and started getting into this kind of thing. So why don't you explain what the 10th Amendment is and what the 10th Amendment Center does?
Okay, so first of all, the 10th Amendment is that part of the Bill of Rights that says that there's a line in the sand. It's the part of the Constitution that says the federal government is only authorized to do a certain amount of stuff. Those powers delegated to the federal government, there's 18 of them in Article 1, Section 8, and about 30 to 35, depending on how you count them, throughout the total document. So about 30 to 35 powers have been delegated to the federal government, and everything else has been reserved to the people of the several states. The idea being is that the founders recognized that you can't have a giant geographic mass with people of varying political, economic, and religious viewpoints living together with one-size-fits-all solutions. solutions, because the only thing that happens in that type of a society is you have a low-grade civil war every couple of years,
Right.
with one side or the other trying to control the entire system. And that's what we have today. Whereas federalism, decentralization, this 10th idea, this 10th Amendment idea, is that you can have people with bad and good ideas. Well, for everybody, views that are outside of our own tend to be the bad ideas. But I'm a Californian. I don't think that our lifestyle here in California should be forced on people in South Carolina or North Dakota or basically anywhere else in the country. And I don't think their lifestyle should be forced on us, whether it's lifestyle choices or economic choices or political choices. And that's what the founders set up, is that you can have all these different options among these different states. And it was 13 at the time, and that was huge because technology hadn't advanced yet. So 50 now is massive, with over 300 million people on all these different political viewpoints. We can all live together in peace instead of being at each other's throats if everyone can have their options in their own area. Now, I wouldn't wish a single-payer healthcare system on anybody, but someone's going to have to do it eventually so people can learn how bad it is in practice. And we don't want them to have that learning experience coming from Washington, D.C., dictated to the entire country. I'd rather see California do it and fail, or Vermont do it and fail, or maybe Vermont do it and succeed in their own way. I don't know, but the way that you learn, the way that the marketplace learns in just about everything is through trial and error. And you can't have trial and error when you have a one-size-fits-all solution. That's the long version.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about de Tocqueville. He talked about the 50 states being 50 laboratories,
right,
where all of these different policies can be experimented. And when I talk about decentralization, I always talk about the fact that if things get really bad here in Kentucky, they do something that I just can't live with, I can go to Tennessee. I don't know why I would want to go to Tennessee, but I could. I could go somewhere else if I want a place where people are really concerned about surveillance. I could go to California, where there's a lot of activism, opposing surveillance. So there's ways to escape various policies that you find distasteful when you live in a decentralized system. When it's one size fits all, pretty much you're stuck with it. So you founded the 10th Amendment Center was in 2006, I believe, which I think is interesting because in a lot of people's minds, when they hear 10th Amendment, they hear states' rights and they hear limited government, and they think, well, you must be a right-wing Republican. And I think people might be interested in to know why you really founded this organization.
Okay, so I mentioned that I was a leftist. I grew up in an area with a socialist mayor. I identified as a Marxist. I was a crappy Marxist, probably, but I definitely was a big government person. I remember hearing the original airline bailouts. Maybe there were original ones before I even learned about the ones. But as I was growing up, I heard about airline bailouts. And my first instinct, my gut instinct was, government's spending all that money to prop up or to bail out these airlines. Why don't they just own them? And I thought I was so smart. And I thought I had come up with the most logical response. But going to a government school that teaches you that government fixes everything, if government's taking action, why wouldn't government be good running these businesses? I had no idea why it would be bad at it. So I didn't learn that. And I think that's now, I may have been a little further along that idiocy than many other people, but I definitely understand where people come from, where they think government can run these types of industries without problem or do it effectively or even just in any positive way. So that was my mentality. And from there, I became an anti-war activist. I still am today in spirit, even though there's no one to march in the streets with really anymore. But during the Bush heydays, just after the Iraq War, the second Iraq War started in 2003, I was out in the streets marching and organizing with groups like the Answer Coalition, which is a communist organization and the precursor to today's Antifa, the bandana-wearing kind of agitators out in the streets. I spent a lot of time in the streets protesting the wars with them. But I started to recognize, and I was lucky to have been introduced to a great writer and speaker named Harry Brown, who was also very anti-war, which is why I liked him. I thought he was a little crazy at first on economic talk, but I was here over and over and over, and I learned from a book from him that that he wrote called Why Government Doesn't Work, I started picking up on things. So I noticed that a lot of the activity in the anti-war movement, at least here in Los Angeles, and we would have 10, 15,000 people out in the streets, but a lot of the activity was focused less on being anti-war, less on being anti-intervention, but just redirection of resources. So instead of having an idea of like, let's end the war, they would come up with ways to come up with catchy signs that would talk about less money for warfare, more money for healthcare. And it was always that message. Let's take the money out of the warfare because it's draining our ability to educate and treat people in the educational system, the healthcare system. And that in conjunction with Harry Brown's teachings, rest in peace, Harry, and the idea that government doesn't work. It always lies to you. Its costs are way higher. It doesn't do what it says it's going to do. I just started to recognize through logic, that smart logic that taught me that government should run the airlines. I also started seeing that government shouldn't do anything. And I was very disheartened from that. And I just started moving more and more towards liberty. And by 2006, I wanted to point out that basically everything that the Bush administration said they were going to do was either a lie or a violation of the limits in the Constitution. So whether it was the Patriot Act or the Iraq War or Medicare Part D or No Child Left Behind or the Real ID Act, I just wanted to write some blogs talking about this in my own unprofessional way and tell people like, look, this isn't right. You can't support him if you're a constitutionalist. And luckily enough, that has taken off, and we've reached a lot of people over the years since then.
You know, it's interesting, looking back at my own kind of journey. One of the hardest things to wrap my head around when I first started working with the 10th Amendment Center, first started volunteering, was the idea that both parties were equally bad on liberty. Because I was still kind of in that Republican mindset. So in my head, you know, Republicans might be a little bit bad, but it was the Democrats that were really, really bad. And as I got into the work, it became much more clear that all of these people are bad. And that's one of the things that I think is really neat about the organization. And I encourage people to check out 10thamendmentcenter.com and look at the work that we're doing, look at the articles, look at the various legislative initiatives that we're engaged in. I think you'll find one of the things that is most refreshing is that we're not left-right. We're not Republican, Democrat. We're not anti-Obama or anti-Trump. We're anti all of them. And that was a hard thing for me, though, when I first started, was coming to grips with what I'd been taught about the political divisions here in the United States were basically a bunch of bullhooey.
Man, when I remember when I started recognizing that America wasn't going around saving the world, I was in tears. Honest to God, this was like early 90s. I'm like, wait a second. I always thought we were the good guys saving everybody. And anyone who's listening to Peter's podcast, I think he's basically doing like at least 3 episodes a week lately with all the economic turmoil and the markets. And this is basically my first listen of the day. He has been just hammering Republicans on their spending, the debt, the tariffs. And this is it's not common to find people that are going to be consistent on their principles, no matter who's in power. A lot of people like their principles or they oppose something. I often talk about, I do a Monday, Wednesday, Friday YouTube show myself called Good Morning Liberty. It's relatively new and small, but I often talk about Ted Cruz as someone who I think exemplifies the problem that we face. Now, Ted Cruz, he was willing to shut down the government over funding of Obamacare when Obama was in office. Right. But earlier this year, because he was being challenged by someone on the left for his Senate seat, all of a sudden he was okay with funding Obamacare. Why wouldn't he be willing to shut it down at that point? That's because the team had switched, and it's always political considerations. And that's why I appreciate the podcast that Peter's doing, because it doesn't matter. He's not like kowtowing to like, well, they're Republicans, so we got to give them a chance. No, inflation, debt, the crazy spending, it's bad no matter who does it. And in some ways, I make the case that it gets worse when Republicans are in charge, because then no one's even pretending to be opposition. No one's even pretending to be for small government anymore. You don't have people saying, oh, Barack Obama, you can't just ban M855 ammo with an executive order like he tried to do near the end of his presidency. They don't do the same thing in response to Trump doing the same thing on a bump stock ban, unless, of course, you're from a good organization like Gun Owners of America. But groups like the NRA is not opposing this, even though they opposed the same type of process when Obama was in office. So the partisanship, I think, leads to bigger and bigger government, more and more debt, more and more spending, and that is a very dangerous place for all of us.
So one of the big things that we do at the 10th Amendment Center is legislative activism at the state and local level to try to confront and stop and as best we can limit the impact of all of these federal acts and actions, primarily by withdrawing resources, state and local resources, state and local personnel from enforcing federal law and implementing federal programs. And this was another thing that I had a hard time wrapping my head around when I first started working with you, because you would often say, never call the 202 area code. if people who don't know 202 area code, that's Washington, D.C. And this perplexed me a little bit because, of course, we're all taught that the most important thing that you can do is call your senator, call your representative, get involved in that presidential election. And I remember, I don't even know if you remember this. I think it was probably within the first year that I was working with you. I went to Washington, D.C. for some congressional 10th Amendment thing and was on this panel. And you were kind of like, okay, go, but whatever. And I was like, why isn't he more excited about this? And now I know, because it was in the 202 area code. But people will often tell me, Mike, this is all great, but really the federal government's so big and powerful, and there's no way that you're going to be able to stop them. We can't stop them. It's almost this, as Rothbard would put it, this debilitating pessimism. How is it that state, local, and individual action can actually have an impact at the federal level?
Well, the reason it has an impact is because the federal government is so big and powerful. The federal government is so big that it actually can't do anything that it wants to do without assistance and resources provided by state and local government. And this is pervasive almost everywhere during the last so-called fake government shutdown, which we're now facing again. Now, we'd all love a real government shutdown because, 99% of what they do, and even if you said 90% of what they do, they shouldn't be doing in the first place. So get rid of all of it. That'd be wonderful. Maybe we can experience how markets work for real. But during the last fake government shutdown back in 2013, the National Governors Association, they put out a statement. They were very concerned about what was going on because, quote, states are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. That's the National Governors Association. States are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. Well, guess what? Partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. So when the federal government wants to implement environmental regulations, almost every state handles the implementation of that. When the federal government wants to enforce gun control laws, the ATF has somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 employees for the entire country. About a third of them are in administration. And my government taught math is horrible. So what does that mean? We've got like 3,500 to 4,500 enforcement agents for the ATF. They have a capacity of closing about 8,000 to 10,000 cases per year. Well, if there were 11 million undocumented short-barreled shotguns in the country in violation of the National Firearms Act of 1934, the federal government absolutely would not have the resources to do anything about that. We see this playing out in immigration sanctuary cities. I know many people from the conservative or libertarian background don't like them, but I think they're very instructive. No one complains about immigration sanctuary cities because of their rhetoric. They don't like them because by simply refusing to help the federal government enforce federal immigration law, whether you think they should or shouldn't, by simply doing that, we see an Achilles heel. The federal government relies heavily on these local communities to do their job for them. The reason is the federal government is involved in too much stuff that it can't even do the things that it's supposed to do without help from local communities. So the most powerful response, and this isn't my idea, Mike, it's not your idea, right? We got it from James Madison. James Madison, the guy who's known as the father of the Constitution, in Federalist 46, gave us 4 steps on how to deal with federal overreach. whether unconstitutional or just bad policy. And Madison said the 4 steps included a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, use civil disobedience, use state legislatures to actually back out of these federal programs. And that was in a time when the federal government was tiny compared to today. That would undermine every federal program, according to James Madison. So when they're involved, when states and feds are partners on most federal programs, we know that the best way to deal with them is just to stop helping them violate our rights. And there is nothing in the Constitution, there's nothing even in Supreme Court case law or precedent that says that states or local communities are required to use resources or manpower to help the federal government enforce their laws or regulatory programs, to help the federal government violate your liberty. Just take a stand down, back down, follow Rosa Parks' idea, and say no, and that can bring down almost every federal program.
Yep, the power of no. So this is like what? We're in the 12th year of the 10th Amendment Center's existence, and done a lot of cool stuff. What is the coolest thing in your mind that the 10th Amendment Center has done?
Man, I think, to be honest with you, this may sound dumb. It's exist. In these, yeah. It's 12 and a half years now.
So we're in June 13th year.
Yeah, it started 13 in June of 2006 is when I registered the domain name. Interestingly enough, I also registered Fifth Amendment Center and fourthamendmentcenter.com. And I was also blogging on property rights and things like that. But I just went with the one that caught on. I just wanted to do something. And I think the fact that it exists in all these years, I've seen so many organizations, so many activists come and go. Mm-hmm. This is not easy to do. It's not easy to raise funds to actually keep this going, to be able to quit my job. For example, you quit your day job to be able to do this and still have a livable existence.
Right.
It's not easy.
Thankfully, we've got the Koch money, right?
Yeah. Right. I mean, right here where I am and where you are the home offices of the 10th Amendment Center, and they're in spare bedrooms or a den, really. So it's that, to me, is the greatest accomplishment, is that we're continuing to be able to put out this message that's consistent, that says liberty is the right way, decentralization, federalism is the way forward, no matter who's in office, no matter who's in charge or who's in power in Washington, D.C., and it's the path forward no matter what. And we're still around doing it. And when the Democrats are in office, the Republicans love us and the Democrats hate us. And it switches around. It goes back and forth and back and forth. But my goal, and I believe it's probably yours as well, is that we're going to continue teaching people, and people are going to learn through example. And I often talk about weed as a great example. We now have over 30 states, 32 states. Is it 33? I forget the number. This is my talking point. It's 33 states. Yeah. 33 states that are now defying Washington, D.C. on a plant that all branches of the federal government and a Supreme Court opinion, Gonzalez versus Raich in 2005, have all sided with the feds that said this plant should never be illegal for any circumstances. And yet the people and the states have made it. Really started with the individuals, because if we're talking about individual liberty, people were buying, selling, growing, consuming these plants before the states gave them permission to do so. Then the states, as lagging indicators, started to get on board because they wanted to get their grubby hands on some of the cash, and they're doing that. And that even makes it grow even further, pun intended. And the feds can't do anything about it, no matter what they try to do. Barack Obama actually tried to ramp up enforcement so aggressively. He actually conducted more raids and spent more money on enforcement than both Bush and Clinton combined in 3 terms. He did this in 1 term, but he wasn't able to shut it down. So then he had to back off. And we're actually doing some research now to see where Trump has gone with that since then. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the feds do, as long as people say no. And when enough people say no to Washington, D.C., and enough states back those people up, there's not much the feds can do to shove these so-called laws, regulations, or band-aids down our throats.
Yep, absolutely. So one of the issues that we work in, or policy areas, is sound money.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to ask you a question now that I don't even know the answer to, because I know that the work in this area started before I came along. How did sound money get on the attack radar? I mean, how did you get into this issue? Do you even remember?
I do. It goes back to war. and the Federal Reserve and the inflation and the printing of money being a tool to fund the empire was my personal motivation. I'm like, man, if you don't deal with the elephant in the room, and that really is the Federal Reserve and the IRS, if you don't come up with ways to deal with it, you're really not dealing with the unconstitutional, illegal, immoral foreign policy. So that was really the starting point, even though I was really clueless about what to do about it, until I came across a paper by a guy named William Green, that he gave at the Austrian Scholars Conference at the Mises Institute back in 2010. Now, I had already followed some efforts along these lines. Basically, you legalize what the federal government prohibits. And that really is, and I don't think he has ever really presented it like I do in regards to weed. Like, people are legalizing what the feds have prohibited there. But the same thing can be done on money. The feds don't want you using gold and silver. They don't want you using actual money as money. They want you to use these inflationary fiat debt notes instead. But the more that states encourage the use, the more that we can have competition in currency. And we know in competition in currency, there is a potential for a reverse Gresham's law where good money can drive out bad, because people can actually see the value of their money holding rather than depreciating like everyone else's. So it was really it's a step by step. I think it's still a long learning process. We've got a lot of great people like JP Cortez that work with us, that help us along on this and do a lot of activism and do a lot of teaching. And I think it's one of the most important ones that we can actually even consider.
Yeah, absolutely. William has agreed to come on the show. So
cool.
Sometime in the very near future, people will get to hear from him, and we'll dig a little bit more into the background. And
he actually drafted the original Constitutional Tender Act that had been introduced and debated in Georgia around 2008 to 2010. The legislator that had introduced it and championed it passed away, but Bill would go and testify, and there were some great videos early on. Basically, look, the Constitution says you're supposed to use gold and silver. No state shall make anything but gold and silver legal tender, but yet all the states have been violating that restriction in forever. So why not just make the Constitution legal again? Let's legalize the Constitution like Ron Paul says, and pass these state bills that don't directly attack the Federal Reserve, but just create an environment where we can have currency competition. And then from there, we can see organization like Money Metals, United Precious Metals Association in Utah, and then even the Texas Bullion Depository, all of which are being geared up to facilitate everyday transactions in real money. Like, one of the arguments against this, and you've heard this, I'm sure, as often as I do, Mike, oh, you like this sound money. What are you going to do? Go to Walmart with a bunch of coins in your pocket and have to carry about a bunch of cash? Well, no, the magic of technology is that you can create a debit card, and you have a savings account or a checking account, in essence, that has real money, so gold and silver in it. And then in the background, as soon as you swipe that card, it converts it to fiat, and then the merchant actually gets the fiat in their account. Now, maybe in the future, a merchant will be able to choose whether they want sound money, real money transferred, rather than the fiat garbage. But the more that people can actually use this type of stuff, use money in day-to-day transactions, the more likely they will to expand on that in the future. I mean, if a dollar's worth $1 today, $1 in gold, and it's always worth $1 in gold, and a fiat dollar is worth 3 cents down the line, sooner or later, someone's going to wise up to this and stop using the fiat.
Exactly. Gold Money is another company
that's the one I was
thinking. Look at that actually does this, where you can buy incremental bits of gold electronically. It's backed by the actual metal, so the actual metal exists. It exists in your name. You can even get the metal if you want to, and you can transact very easily with other folks.
Gold Money does the Visa card as well too. So correct. I mean, you could go to Amazon and buy stuff with gold. I mean, the right way to do this, in my view, though, is not just to spend the money and then turn it into fiat so that the merchant has fiat. It's always do a buy and replace. Right. And maybe at some point, a Gold Money or somebody else will create an automated system where you can opt into, like, you put some fiat in your account, and every time you spend, you replace. So then you're always having the strongest purchasing power, but you're not lowering the amount of actual sound money you have in your account. Because if you have $1,000 or $10,000 and you spend it down to zero, you should always be trying to replenish that. That's so you have the stronger purchasing power on a day-to-day basis, whether you're going to the gas station, Amazon, or wherever.
Here's another cool concept that is relatively new in the United States that I just learned about not too long ago. Peter Schiff actually did a video about it. It's a company called Mine. I believe that's how you pronounce it. And you can actually buy 24 karat gold jewelry. But the difference is, if you go to your jewelry store and you buy jewelry, you're basically buying 14 karat gold generally. You're paying a huge markup. You're paying more for the artistry of the jewelry than you are the actual precious metals. Mine sells 24 karat pure gold, and they sell it based on weight with a very small markup, basically just like buying a bullion coin. So if you're interested in holding gold for the long term, you can buy their beautiful necklaces, bracelets, rings, charms. You can buy these things in 24 karat gold. You can actually go on the website after you buy it and see how your investment has gone up, because again, it's based on the weight of the gold. And this is how a lot of people in the East, Asia, China, China's in Asia, India, China, other places in the Far East, this is how they hold gold. They hold it in the form of 24 karat jewelry. So there's a lot of options out there for people who want to get into precious metals that maybe can't afford to buy a 1 ounce bullion coin that costs, almost $1,200 right now. And you kind of hit on a couple of things that I want to highlight. The first thing being is that it really is the Federal Reserve that makes the whole behemoth government function.
Yes.
There's no way that it could run all of its programs and its wars if it didn't have the central bank backing up the debt. And by undermining that, that's one way that we can limit the federal government, is to get rid of the powerful central bank that's controlling all of the money. And then I think another thing that you highlight is really this idea of individuals. It really starts with individuals, and we can make all the laws that we want, and we can do things to make it easier to hold gold and silver, to use sound money, but it doesn't work unless people do it. So
yes.
That's the key of taking advantage of things like the Texas Bullion Depository or gold money or Mine or all of these different things. We need people who believe in sound money to start using sound money. And by doing that, it creates currency competition. And that's really all we're talking about. It's like anything else. You want to have competition. Monopolies are never good. I don't understand why
they don't exist without government force.
Exactly.
Mind you, right? So this monetary monopoly we've been facing is just it's government force to prop up a system that can't continue forever if there is competition. So the end of this system, this monopolized, this forced inflationary system, is over as long as people start exercising choice in large numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the 10th Amendment Center, see, my brain is going to over there. On the show notes page for this show, I will post some links about the work that we're doing on sound money specifically. And we've written about this on the Shift Gold website as well. Yes. Some various things that are going on in Arizona, primarily dealing with taxation, things in Utah in terms of making legal tender, Wyoming, various states that are working on this. I'll post some of those links so people can see exactly what we're doing more.
Mike, I think you're actually one of the best in summarizing the issue of taxation for using gold and silver in transactions, because as we know, the power to tax is the power to destroy. And one of the ways that they do this, it's pretty sneaky and people don't really pay attention to it, but you exchange, if you want to use gold and silver in transactions in some states, and it was more years ago, right, they would charge you a capital gains tax on that transaction. So if you bought the gold at $600 worth of fiat, and then it's worth $1,000 later, and you want to go spend that with your gold money debit card, they're going to charge you a tax on that $400 gain. And you have a really great, I can't even do it, but you've got a really great sum.
It's basically like if you had a dollar bill and you walk into the bank and you say, hey, bank, I need 4 quarters. And they charge you $1.10 to give you 4 quarters.
Yeah.
So basically, they're charging you a tax on the exchange of one kind of money for another. And I can't take credit for that. I think J.P. Cortez might have come up with that.
You verbalize it. And I think that in and of itself has been one of the greatest roadblocks for people ever wanting to use money as money. And as you get that, this is one of these small steps. It's really, there are many pieces to this puzzle, this whole financial monopoly, this puzzle of inflation and debt and printing. That get in the way of more freedom. And this is one of the small pieces that's very important. It's part of our entire plan, is remove these types of capital gains taxes on a state-by-state level, because then people don't have the cost of actually exercising their liberty. And we've seen this happen. Ron Paul came out to testify in favor of a bill to do things like this in Arizona last year. We had tried to get that same bill passed for 3 sessions. It was vetoed by 2 different governors over 3 straight years. Ron Paul finally said, you know what, I'm getting on board on this. And of course, it was passed and then signed by the governor that time.
Yeah,
so
that's where Ron Paul said, you don't tax money.
Yeah,
flat out. And what do you do when you don't want somebody to do something? You throw a tax on it. I mean, very familiar with that, living here in Kentucky and watching the way they taxed the tobacco industry out of existence.
Oh, right.
So, these taxes, they're not just to raise revenue. They are intentional because they want to nudge us into certain behaviors. And the powers that be don't want us holding precious metals. They don't want us using precious metals in our day-to-day activity. They want us to use the Federal Reserve monopoly money. And that's exactly what it is, monopoly money. That's about what it's worth.
It's an IOU, isn't it? Technically, really?
Technically, it is. Yeah, that's one of the things that smart economic people will tell you, that there's counterparty risk. So behind that dollar, there is something else that exists that has to give it its value.
Faith, right? Isn't it faith?
Basically. And so anything that has counterparty risk, you risk losing some or all of the value of that. There is no counterparty risk if you have a physical precious metal in your hand. You hold it in your hand, you own it, you possess it. There's nobody else backing it. It has intrinsic value.
Do you know where Gold Money does the storage offhand, or no?
I do not. I know that the company is based in Canada. I know that Schiff Gold works with them specifically.
Yeah.
Actually,
and I know he's
used. Schiff Gold actually is owned by Gold Money.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I know Peter Schiff. He's also worked with Perth for storage of gold in the past. So I'm not sure if Gold Money does that too. And I think that was something that he's talked about for years. Where you store it is very important, because you want to get it out of the hands of the gold grabbers here in the U.S. who have shown a willingness to steal that from people.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people are interested in learning more about that, that's where you call one of the Schiff Gold precious metal specialists. 1-888 Gold 160, and they can tell you all of the various storage options. I know that Schiff Gold offers storage options both in the United States and overseas, where you can physically hold your metal and have relatively easy access to it. So I'm about done. I've got one more question for you. And this is
let's do it.
This is the most important question, actually. I'll be honest with you, I already know the answer of it because I edit all of your stuff. But I always ask everybody this question. I don't know, you've been on Alan Mosley's show, The Gold Standard. He always asks whether a hot dog is a sandwich. So this is my question. If you were typing, do you double space after every sentence?
I'm not supposed to.
No, you're not.
But a lot of my typing ends up being copying from previous typing before you have repeatedly hammered into my face that you're not supposed to double space. So it's something that I'll learn and improve on in maybe the next 5 to 10 years. I'm sorry to say, Mike, it's going to take that long.
Right. Actually, the stuff that you type, you don't tend to do it. But it is. I can tell when you've copied and pasted stuff because it'll be in there. And then that's even worse because it's like half right and half not.
And I don't think a hot dog is a sandwich.
A hot dog is absolutely a sandwich.
So, sorry.
You have something between 2 pieces of bread. That is by definition a sandwich.
Most of my hot dogs don't actually have bread. I can't eat a lot of wheat, so I just have it bacon wrapped. So that's, unless you're talking about a bacon sandwich.
Whoa. We'll have to talk to Alan about this.
That's deep. That's deep.
That's getting pretty deep. Well, before we go, I'm going to give you an opportunity to point people to any link or social media channel or whatever you want to highlight that they can find Michael Boldin in the 10th Amendment Center.
Okay, so what we're talking about today, Mike, and first of all, thank you again for having me on the show. This is really fun. It's awesome. And I love the work that you're doing at Schiff Gold, too. I'm learning a lot more from you than the other way around these days. So it's really awesome. Thank you. But we're really scratching the surface of what the philosophy and the strategy is about here. And so I always recommend that people start with our free 80-page annual report on the state of the nullification movement over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, which you primarily write. I do some editing and direction on and formatting. But the report has two main sections. The first half of it talks about the philosophy, the constitutional basis, the basis in liberty, the principles, and the strategy. And then the second half talks about how it's being implemented today. So a lot of people might think like, oh, okay, these are great ideas, but I mean, it's never going to work. Well, it is working. It's happening, and it's happening on a lot of different issues, whether it's on sound money, it's on surveillance, it's on growing plants, it's on the right to keep and bear arms, it's on undermining the monopoly or the control that the federal government has over the healthcare system. So there's so many different things that we see it playing out on, asset forfeiture as well. And that's it. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. It's about 80 pages. It's free to download, free to read. And I think that's the best place to go. And I hope people find it interesting.
Cool. Twitter? Are you a Twitterer?
Yeah, at 10th Amendment, TENTH Amendment, or at Michael Boldin, MICHAEL, Boldin, BOLDIN.
Cool. Do you get in Twitter flame wars?
No, I try to avoid that. I will sometimes hammer on some people, but I don't want to get into debates because you can spend, and a lot of people do this, they will spend their whole day debating people. And for me, while I want to teach people, I learned from Harry Brown that when you find someone who is totally opposed to your viewpoints, it's pointless because you aren't going to convince them in a debate, especially if it's online. But you can use their viewpoints as a teachable moment. Maybe you can have some interaction with them and point out this is a very common view, and then write a blog or do a video about it, explain it to other people who are willing to listen. Now, there are over 300 million people in the United States, and here at the 10th Amendment Center, we have not reached close to as many of them as we need to. If we ever get to the point where we've got a critical mass where we're advancing liberty in huge ways, then maybe I'll spend my time debating every last person on their idiocy on Twitter or whatever platform is around at that point. But we've got a lot of other work to teach people that liberty works, and I want to see that happen in practice rather than on social media.
Yeah, well, I'm converting those 300 million people one Facebook argument at a time. I'm guilty. I confess. It is what it is. I have learned from you to make it into a blog, so that's I guess that's a positive step forward.
Well, the thing is, it's really, and Harry would talk about this, and that's why I like Peter's show. He'll often talk about like, oh, here's some absurd commentary on CNBC or something like that, and talk about it, because you're going to, instead of having a debate with that individual where it's going to be maybe 5 people watching the comments or a couple hundred, you're reaching thousands upon thousands with a podcast or a video or a blog post, and you can do a lot more good by channeling your frustration with these idiots that way.
Yep, absolutely. Well, again, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy, busy man, and I appreciate you taking a few minutes to chat with me. And peace out, man.
You rule. I really appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye. You've been watching It's Your Dime, an interview series presented by Shift Gold. For more information on investing in gold and silver, talk to a Shift Gold precious metal specialist today at 1-888-GOLD-160. That's 1-888-465-3160. Or visit us on the web at shiftgold.com. You can keep up with all of the latest precious metals news at shiftgold.com/news, and tune in each week to the Shift Gold Friday Gold Wrap podcast. This is your host, Mike Meharry. I appreciate you watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.